Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Alison Mounts on borders, islands, and migration. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, the CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week it's my pleasure to welcome a guest here into the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, to address some topic of global governance or international public policy. And this week I'm very pleased to welcome Alison Mounts, who's the Canada Research Chair in Global Migration Studies and Associate Professor in the Balsley School of International Affairs, as well as Wilfrid Laurier University's Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. And welcome, Alison.
Thank you. Hello. It's nice to be here.
So, Alison, you're one of the people associated with the International Migration Research Center at Wilfrid Laurier University, which is a fast-growing, increasingly dynamic group of scholars who study migration and related issues.
That's
from
correct.
a variety of perspectives. You're a geographer, so you approach migration from a geographer's perspective. And of course, we'll talk about policies and governance issues as we go along today. But I'm curious to know, first of all, a little bit more about the research you've been engaged in, and secondly, how you approach it as a geographer.
Okay. I'll answer both of those. I, for the last several years, have been engaged in a project that's all about the role that islands play in global migration. For many years, I've studied global migration, and actually I was studying shifts in border enforcement practices, and I found that increasingly people kept talking about islands over and over again. They kept coming up, and geographers tend to ask locational questions. Why are things located in the places that they are? And so I wondered, why do islands keep cropping up every time I tend to do more and more research on border enforcement? And of course, there's a very logical geographical answer, which is to say that border enforcement has been moving more and more offshore, farther outward from the traditional lines that we think of on the map as constituting the borders or the boundaries of sovereign territory. So states themselves have been acting more transnationally in their enforcement of migration and in their attempts to regulate migration. So the project that I'm working on asks why islands have become important and what role they play in both the transnational practices of states and also the transnational migration journeys that people themselves embark on, sometimes individually, but often with the assistance of human smugglers, usually traveling by sea. So there are some really obvious reasons why islands become sites of struggles over migration, over entry into the nation state. Often people get intercepted at sea and then their boat gets towed to an island. Also, islands have frequently military histories or colonial histories that might mean they have the infrastructure for detention to happen there. So people end up sometimes getting intercepted when they're on their way somewhere and in a detention facility and in a kind of spatial limbo of sorts. So let's say you were trying to get to Australia to make an asylum claim or just to enter illicitly to work. People who are on ships often constitute what policymakers call mixed flows. So some of them will be defined as more economic or economically motivated migrants. Others may be fleeing persecution and trying to get somewhere to make an asylum claim. So let's say someone's intercepted by the Australian Navy and brought to an island. So they might be brought to Christmas Island, where Australia has a large detention facility, or to even an Indonesian island. And so people enter into a kind of limbo period. They're not quite where they were intending to go. They might be refusing to go home or unable to go home for various reasons, and they're sort of stuck in this liminal space somewhere in between their country of origin and what they were planning or hoping maybe would be their country of destination. And that brings up all sorts of complex issues around jurisdiction and legal status, access to rights, and so on. So I've been working with a fabulous team of researchers who are graduate students and a postdoctoral fellow, and we've been doing research on a number of the islands that specifically emerge as places where both, you could say, states and migrants and advocates and lawyers are all kind of struggling over these issues of migration, rights, asylum, and detention.
Now, where do we find these? So we read in the newspapers here in Canada about Lampedusa in the Mediterranean. We read about Australia and its immigration policy.
Mm-hmm.
Is it basically those two parts of the world, or are these issues in various other places as well?
Yeah, no, not exclusively those sites at all, although those are a couple of our key field sites. You find long histories of detention on islands and many more places that today are sites where people have ended up either very informally waiting on, somewhere along the transnational journey that they're making, or more formally detained by a state. So, for example, there are a long history of islands being used in migration to the US, particularly in the Caribbean. You can think of Guantanamo Bay before it gained its current notoriety as a site where under Bush there were foreign enemy combatants. There were asylum seekers detained there, particularly from Haiti and from Cuba. So people who were picked up at sea were often brought to the naval base there. Also, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, the Marianas, which are US territories, have been places where people have landed en route to try to make an asylum claim or just to work in that region. Those are US bits of territory very far away, obviously from sovereign territory, but closer to the regions of origin that people might be coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So there are issues going on there as well, and in fact Guam is one of our field sites.
Yeah.
And then all of the southern EU, islands associated with Europe. So the Canary Islands, Malta, Greece, and Lampedusa, as you mentioned, which become entry points. So often it's the islands that are somewhere in between the places that people are coming from and the places that they're trying to get to that become these sites of all kinds of negotiations between states, between individuals, between different groups. So, and it's highly dynamic. Often you can think almost symbiotically or certainly relationally about the enforcement that goes on, and then the smuggling industry. So it's widely believed that anytime you harden the border or strengthen border enforcement in one location, smugglers will change their routes, and migrants too, so they'll go somewhere else. And so we see over the last several years actually a lot of movement of migration routes along those islands that I just mentioned. It used to be that there were thousands of people going to the Canary Islands, and then Frontex essentially stepped up enforcement in that region, and so the migrations move, and on goes the story.
Squeeze the balloon in one place and it boulders in another.
Yeah, there are a lot of
We'll be back again to
analogies.
talk further about that with Allison Mounts. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So I have the impression, which is probably just wrong, that most migrants either cross a land border or fly into airports. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us just what do the numbers show? What proportion of people actually do wind up finding themselves on an island? And those people aren't deliberately going to islands, presumably, in many cases, are they? They're being taken to islands by states.
That's correct. You're correct that it's a statistically small number of people who actually attempt to enter by sea. But what's interesting is that they occupy a disproportionately large place in public discourse and in media, and sometimes in policy configurations. So Canada is a good example. The number of people who've come to Canada by boat, both recently, say over the last 10 to 12 years, and historically, is fairly small if you look at the numbers. However, each time that there has been a boat arrival, and I'm thinking specifically of the boats that arrived in 1999 from Fujian, China, off the west coast, and then more recently the boats of Tamil Sri Lankans that were intercepted during 2 consecutive summers, there have been enormous responses, both from the public, unprecedented media coverage, front page stories that are sustained for months, and in both cases, responses by the federal government in terms of changes to policy, specifically around detention, around what are often called front-end security measures pertaining to refugee claims and security checks and so on, as well as usually an increase in fines for smugglers, so an attempt to try to prosecute the smugglers, which is not often successful. So that story plays itself out globally, that although the numbers are relatively small, the attention that's paid by many audiences is relatively large. Now, statistically, it's really hard to give hard numbers precisely because of two things. One is the informality of what's going on. Obviously, smugglers and migrants aren't necessarily trying to announce themselves as they enter
right.
or wherever they end up, either landing or being intercepted. And sometimes states themselves, authorities themselves, are actually trying to not necessarily publicize what's going on at sea or in detention facilities. All of the islands where we've been working have histories actually of hiding, of trying to hide some of the things that have happened in detention facilities, or for a time denying the entry of human rights monitors, for example. So it makes islands sort of all the more significant. Again, although the numbers are small, they are places that receive a lot of attention, both domestically and internationally.
And if you're processed on an island, you are usually always treated like a criminal? Potential criminal? I mean, there is detention involved, restrictions on your liberty. Are there any restrictions on your ability to communicate with the outside world?
There's certainly a degree of criminalization that goes on, and certainly a degree of criminality in the legal process that's going on. However, it really varies by site whether or not people have, what kind of access they have to everything from the asylum claims process to legal representation, interpreters, advocacy, and so on. It really depends on the island, on the status of the island. So some islands, they have subnational jurisdictions, some are independent nation states, some are overseas territories, as in the case of Christmas Island. Guam is an unincorporated territory of the US, so it really varies legally what kind of access people have, but certainly there's one common story that we could tell, which is that people, because of the isolation that they experience in detention on an island, which you could almost see as an island within an island, they have certainly more mediated access to any kind of legal procedure or asylum and so on. And that story, it takes a different path, but it varies across islands. And certainly, I think that we can see the numbers, just to go back to your earlier question, the numbers fluctuate so much, partly because there's this story of the very performative and public nature of enforcement, right? So if it's found out that people are not succeeding at getting in some place, they might be going somewhere else. And policy often changes. It's very reactive to these kind of high-profile human smuggling stories and incidents that happen at sea. So that we could take the example of Italy. It used to be that when migrant ships or migrants landed by boat on Lampedusa, they might make an asylum claim in Italy, and they would be transferred to Sicily. However, around 2005, Italy stopped that practice so that people would be held on Lampedusa in detention. Again, you sort of start to see the introduction of distance and the mediation of their access, because it used to be that a lot of people would eventually, sometimes regardless of the outcome of their asylum claim, make their way out of detention and end up working seasonally, as migrant laborers. Again, you go back to that idea of mixed flows. Some people going to work, some people going to make claims, and all of these sort of coming out in a jumble over time. Now, in 2009, Italy started to pursue what's called a pushback policy, intercepting people at sea much more aggressively, so never actually allowing them to even reach Lampedusa, and entering into all sorts of arrangements to return them more quickly to the places that they're coming from, or to one of the nearer states that will take them, usually Libya. So
how can they do that? I mean, it's not legal, is it, to intercept somebody at sea unless they're in your territorial waters?
Well, there are a lot of arrangements, and here we go back to the relationship that you often find in the global governance of migration between formal procedures and informal procedures or practices, and formal arrangements and informal arrangements. And there are a lot of bilateral arrangements where people agree to returns, they agree to take people back, or they even agree to detain people. So for example, between Australia and Indonesia, there's a relationship. Australia has been funding the construction of detention facilities around Indonesia, which again introduces a real limbo around legality. So if you're, let's say you're from Afghanistan, you're making your way to Australia, and you end up in detention in Indonesia, where are you? You know, yes, you're in Indonesia. Indonesia is not a signatory to the convention relating to the status of refugees. You wanted to get to Australia. You're not quite an asylum seeker. You're almost a potential asylum seeker. You haven't even reached the territory that enables you to become legally an asylum seeker. And so you're in this utter legal limbo in Indonesia. And we see that repeat itself. So yes, there have been accusations around illegality of what's happening, both with the boarding of ships on international seas, and also the return of people, which has been argued is in violation of the principle of non-refoulement, where people will not be returned to a place where they're in danger. And you also have a lot of what are called third party or third country practices where someone steps in. So for example, many of the people who are being returned to Libya are not actually from Libya, but Libya is willing to enter into these arrangements with Italy. And there are often very informal, almost what have been called development strategies going on, where Italy is investing a lot in the infrastructure that enables some of these things to happen in Libya, which of course fell apart recently.
Yes.
Hence you see the numbers. In 2010, after the pushback policy, the numbers had really dropped on Lampedusa. There were almost no people in detention for a time in the summer of 2010 when we were there doing some field work. There were boats that were landing from time to time. They would get through that sort of net at sea, but they would be quickly transferred elsewhere. Things were very quiet on Lampedusa. Then the Arab Spring happened and the numbers exploded. And I've seen estimates ranging from 26,000 to 48,000 people landing on Lampedusa just in 2011.
And demonstrations by the inhabitants of Lampedusa.
That's right. These are very contested arrivals, very contested situations.
Well, we'll be back to talk further about islands, borders, and migration with Allison Mounts. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So for our remaining time, what I'd like to do is talk a bit about national policies and global governance and the interplay between those two. But let's start with the national policies. So are there countries that are particularly well behaved with regard to handling migrants in island contexts, and countries that are particularly badly behaved in regard to handling them?
Well, I would say in the context, I was thinking beyond the context of islands, because of course there's a very recursive relationship between what's happening on the island and what's happening on mainland territory. And I was about to praise Canada because Canada historically has been seen as a leader in issues of refugee resettlement and having, you know, many protections built in over time into the refugee claimant process. However, recently that's been changing, in part due to some of the very high-profile arrivals that I mentioned earlier by boat in 1999 and again in the last few years. There have been all sorts of, we have Bill C-4 and all sorts of proposals around the slippery slope to mandatory detention, and things are definitely changing here too. However, the reason why I then hesitated is that although Canada has many islands, it's not really as defined a set of islands. Canada doesn't have anything like the kind of very explicit decisions that a country like Australia has made to use islands.
So not having an island detention facility is an indication that your immigration policy is probably better than average.
I think that's fair to say. Or at the very least that you haven't. I mean, you know, Hannah Arendt, Giorgio Agamben, scholars like these have made arguments over the years that if you look at the treatment of non-citizens, you learn a lot about sovereign power, right? About issue of human rights and the role that states play on the global stage. And certainly, you know, you asked me for some of the bad practices. I'd say Australia especially has a pretty checkered history, as does the US. In the Australian case, it's fascinating to think of, in recent years, what's very well known is what was called Australia's Pacific Solution, which again began with this very high-profile incident where a ship called the MV Tampa attempted to rescue a ship carrying I think close to 400 people who were in distress. The ship was in distress, and then Prime Minister John Howard basically sort of threw down the gauntlet and said that ship will not land on Australian territory. Enough is enough. And so a standoff ensued between the Australian Navy and the captain of the ship, and the law of the sea would suggest that you're allowed to go to the closest port when you are doing a rescue, which is the law, that you rescue a ship in distress. But eventually what happened was one of these third parties practices that I mentioned, where other countries basically stepped in and offered to house people. So they were brought to the small island state of Nauru. They were brought to Christmas Island, which is Australian territory, and eventually other islands got drawn into what came to be known as Australia's Pacific Solution. Australia practiced what's called the power of excision. So the Parliament met and retroactively excised many bits of its own territory from Australia for the purposes of migration. So for the purposes of migration law, if you were on Christmas Island, for example, you were not technically in Australia because of this excision. So all kinds of creative things, relationships between geography and the law emerge. So that was called the Pacific Solution, and more recently people have called the offshoring even farther away in Indonesia the Indonesian solution. So we see again the sort of informal exchanges where Australia is funding some of these enforcement practices and infrastructure in Indonesia.
And what's driving that? Is this just xenophobia? Is that what it boils down to?
It's hard to say exactly what drives these decisions, but certainly there's a political will for them. That is something that you find. It's not, as I said, the responses to very high-profile, kind of tragic human stories of ships at sea, ships being lost at sea, horrible things happening. These have a life. They can stay on the front of the newspaper for a long time, be the lead story in the news. And so I think politicians are often motivated to capitalize on those. And actually that's an argument that I make in the book that I published last year called Seeking Asylum, where often these moments that play out as crises become moments when enforcement agendas are moved forward, which have political capital, which have the often tacit support of the public. And so often it's the political agenda that's driving things, not necessarily respect for the law or respect for the Refugee Convention, protecting people's rights, or even sort of a more calm and rational look at the numbers of people who are arriving, which, as you said, when we started speaking, tend to be fairly small. There's also an argument about the industry of detention. Detention can be big business, and I'd say that's a place where the United States has to be shamed as a really terrible example. We currently have about 350 facilities in the U.S. where people are in detention. I mean, an array of different kinds of facilities. Some of them are dedicated federal detention facilities. Many of them are local county jails where the federal government essentially pays for beds to house its federal detainees. So, if you start to look around arguments about the privatization of detention and the prison industry, and sometimes even the idea that in some of these places, so some of the islands where we work, detention becomes a really big employer. So for example, on Christmas Island, the local population is around 1,100 or so. The population in detention when we were there last summer in 2011 was around 2,600. And Australia built an enormous high security facility there. So we heard stories of people on Christmas Islanders who hadn't worked during their lifetime necessarily, but had gone to work at the detention facility. They couldn't staff the detention facility, and when we were there Other places, so for example, the local grocery store had shut down because they couldn't staff the grocery store. So people were being flown in. More flights had been added on. There are these very interesting stories to tell that are almost old geographical stories about resource industries and what happens when you put a big employer in a small place.
Fascinating.
So,
It's almost the opposite of the not in my backyard syndrome.
Almost.
We'll be back again with Allison Mounts. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So to what extent is this issue governed globally? Is this a national policy world that we're in with respect to these migrants, or is there in fact some kind of global or even regional governance regime that's supposed to regulate and discipline, provide norms for the handling of these situations?
I'd say that it has traditionally been quite a national issue, immigration generally, but that we're seeing recent moves towards more concerted efforts at both regional solutions, which is a phrase that comes up a lot in immigration circles, and global governance of migration, which also is coming up more and more as a trend and as a real effort by various both states and different parties to try to bring different states that are interested in this to the table. The problem is that, well, the problems are many. The challenge with migration is that there are very many different reasons why people migrate. Some are economic migrants. People move for all kinds of reasons, everything from studying to tourism. And so very different kinds of tools will be used in the governance of migration, which encompasses all sorts of things from passport, documents, visas, to the more kind of security-minded issues where you have national security efforts. And so I'd say we're seeing this kind of piecemeal set of arrangements, a lot of bilateral agreements between states around return to countries of origin, for example, start to crystallize into more regional and global conversations. Certainly there are UN conventions, particularly relating to the status of refugees, that dictate some of what's happening. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees is very involved, of course, with that population or with those populations. However, there are much larger populations on the move, and particularly, in the kind of migrations that we've been studying that sort of draw the attention of border enforcement, for example. And so what we're seeing, for example, in the EU is a lot of regional effort at member states collaborating through Frontex as the coordinating agency and border enforcement. We see—
Is that supranational governance, or is that individual European countries doing their own thing with respect to migration policy but coordinating with each other?
Yeah. I'd say both. I'd say there's a real attempt at supranational governance, clearly, through the EU, and that in some of these areas of migration, those attempts have been more successful than in others. So people have been much more sort of amenable to working together at creating norms and laws around labor migration, for example, within the EU, easing border crossings for the purposes of work. But they've been much slower to create norms and laws around a common asylum policy. And again, here you get into the thorny issues that we were talking about, the domestic politics versus, the sort of desire or willingness to, certainly not a desire, but a willingness to give up some of one's sovereign power to be part of a supranational body. You see that in a place like Malta, where Malta used to be a transit country. People would pass through. Malta's very close to Sicily. It's another of those entry points, or that's become what's often called a hotspot, where people would pass through trying to get into the EU. So Malta didn't actually have to worry too much itself about migration. It has a very long history of migration. But since joining the EU, there are different standards that Malta has to uphold. And so you've seen very recently detention increase there, and a lot of attention attention paid by the European Union to what's happening on those peripheral locations of islands, including
What's
Malta.
the role of non-state actors in these governance arrangements? And who are they and what do they try to do?
Yeah, I'd say the role is very important, often because of the kind of limbo that people end up in, and certainly just because of the way that asylum works. People often will seek assistance if it's available. I mean, it's less available. That's the issue of geography on some of these remote islands. But often there are advocacy communities, there are interpreters. Sometimes this is referred to as the refugee industry. And certainly when we were on Christmas Island, we saw this refugee industry flourishing. Interpreters were being flown in, and certainly you see activists calling attention to what's happening in places where human rights violations are happening, where people aren't getting access to asylum where they should have access. So those are some of the third parties. You could also think, non-state actors. You could also think of the industries, the corporations involved. You know, everyone from the people who build and run detention facilities to those who service them, people who might fly, flights into Christmas Island. There are a lot of kind of secondary industries associated with what's going on. So I'd say industry, advocacy, and also international organizations such as the International Organization for Migration, which plays a role both in terms of the movement of individuals or groups of migrants, but also in providing a forum for some of the states involved to come to the table to make arrangements.
An enormous range of players and stakeholders. Well, a complex issue, but congratulations on the work you've done, and all the best as it continues moving forward. To our audience, thank you for joining us today, and join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.
Locational questions. Why are things located in the places that they are? And so I wondered, why do islands keep cropping up every time I tend to do more and more research on border enforcement? And of course, there's a very logical geographical answer, which is to say that border enforcement has been moving more and more offshore, farther outward from the traditional lines that we think of on the map as constituting the borders or the boundaries of sovereign territory. So states themselves have been acting more transnationally in their enforcement of migration and in their attempts to regulate migration. So the project that I'm working on asks why islands have become important and what role they play.
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Allison Mounts on borders, islands, and migration. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, the CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week it's my pleasure to welcome a guest here into the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, to address some topic of global governance or international public policy. And this week I'm very pleased to welcome Allison Mounts, who's the Canada Research Chair in Global Migration Studies and Associate Professor in the Balsley School of International Affairs, as well as Wilfrid Laurier University's Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. And welcome, Allison.
Thank you. Hello. It's nice to be here.
So, Allison, you're one of the people associated with the International Migration Research Center at Wilfrid Laurier University, which is a fast-growing, increasingly dynamic group of scholars who study migration and related issues from a variety of perspectives. You're
in both the transnational practices of states and also the transnational migration journeys that people themselves embark on, sometimes individually, but often with the assistance of human smugglers, usually traveling by sea. So there are some really obvious reasons why islands become sites of struggles over migration, over entry into the nation state. Often people get intercepted at sea and then their boat gets towed to an island. Also, islands have frequently military histories or colonial histories. That might mean they have the infrastructure for detention to happen there. So people end up sometimes getting intercepted when they're on their way somewhere.
Geographer, so you approach migration from a geographer's perspective, and of course we'll talk about policies and governance issues as we go along today, but I'm curious to know, first of all, a little bit more about the research you've been engaged in, and secondly, how you approach it as a geographer.
Okay, I'll answer both of those. I, for the last several years, have been engaged in a project that's all about the role that islands play in global migration. For many years, I've studied global migration, and actually I was studying shifts in border enforcement practices, and I found that increasingly people kept talking about islands over and over again. They kept coming up, and geographers tend to ask